Warning: the following video contains content that may be sensitive or traumatizing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. Oya Obinidodo is a solo rapper from the United States. She began with her first album Not Your Property in 2022, and then released a second album The Rough Odows in 2024. Obinidodo, whose real name is Thea Arnold, is also a US migrant and is known for traveling to different states in search of a better life and to escape the bullying and poverty. Here are some of the places she's been to. Florida. Oya Obinidodo's history in Florida stretches back to the early 90s. She visited the Jacksonville area of Florida as a child, riding the Greyhound bus. Her mother took her there every summer. Her greatest memory is drinking Arizonas and going to Disney World. By 2016, she went to Florida by herself, running from the police and a human trafficker. She went to Miami. After arriving to Miami, she went to Little Haiti. She lived in Little Haiti rent-free for 2 months. She spent most of her days traveling around the city, going to the beach, getting high, and to see a therapist. It was her first time ever going to Miami. She didn't make any friends or any money, she just stayed in her lane. After 2 months, Oya Obinidodo became homeless and didn't have anywhere else to live in Miami. She left Miami, but went back in 2017. Before stopping, she stopped in Jacksonville. She stayed in Jacksonville for a few nights, working as an escort. She remembers her customers clearly. One of them was from the north side. He was really scary to her. She then went back to her hotel at the Comfort Suites in the Bay Meadows area. Another older man came into the room. He was an older black man. Everyone after that was a blur. She eventually went back to Miami. This time, things got wild. She was really on the streets, sleeping in her rental car. She started working as a dancer at a club. To this day, the pain is still there.
I could feel a strong presence over me. I knew it was voodoo. One of the men that I started seeing while I was working told me that the marijuana I was purchasing had black magic on it. Everywhere I went, I felt the presence of voodoo. It was a strong presence that I couldn't shake. I used to be in public places and see people with goats. I saw goats everywhere. One time I was driving down Okeechobee, I felt woozy. I felt like I was going to die. I was so paranoid, I even thought my car was going to blow up. I thought it was a bomb in it.
Oya Obinidodo worked at over 7 nightclubs in the Miami area, including a club called Coco's, The Office, and Mint Lounge. Of course, she felt out of place but still made money. She spent most of her nights after work, parking in different places, sleeping in her car. She was still homeless, and she made just enough money to eat, buy clothes, and pay for the flashy car she was driving. On a fast night, she would make $400. For the most part, the clubs paid well, but one of the clubs was so bad that she only lasted 1 day. She was dancing at a Mexican club, going by her middle name Michelle. She left the club and went to a hotel with one of the men and was caught. She didn't care. Strip clubs were a dime a dozen in Miami. One of her clients told her that stripping wasn't for her, and that she was too cool to be in such a horrible environment. She eventually stopped working in Miami and went to Pompano Beach. She worked at a club called 4Play. The people in Pompano Beach were much easier to deal with and way nicer. By that time, she had enough money to pay for the car and for hotel rooms. She didn't have to sleep in the car anymore. One day, when it was time to turn the rented car in at the airport, the attendant said that they had been alerted that her license was suspended, and she was not allowed to switch the car out for another one. She got on a Greyhound and left Miami. She went to Tampa and spent most of her days at the gym playing basketball. She felt like she was losing her mind.
I felt funny. So many eyes had saw me at those clubs. I had never felt so off in all of my life. I didn't belong there. The client was right. I felt embarrassed and I felt like a loser. I didn't want to be on the city bus. I knew it was time to get out of Florida. People were faker to me than they appeared, especially without a car.
She tried working at one more club in Tampa, but it didn't last long. After visiting a tattoo shop, she decided to head to another city and see another client in Orlando, before leaving Florida for good. The client allowed her to stay at his home overnight with his girlfriend and child, and didn't ask her for anything in return. She hasn't returned to Florida since, and is very scared to. NYC. Oya Obinidodo's first trip to NYC was in 2004. She rode on a bus with her mother to go shopping in the fashion district. By 2014, nearly a decade later, she started getting on the Chinese bus to NYC by herself. The following year, she met a man on Instagram. He promised her a better life in NYC and fell for it. After meeting the man, he took her to a hotel in Flushing, Queens and pimped her out. One of her clients happened to be a rich music producer from Miami, Florida that went by the name Jack Music. After being in Flushing, the pimp, who had been to Rikers Island, moved her to Corona, Queens, where he brutally started beating her every day. The pimp, who was a member of the Piru Bloods gang, and was going by the name Chuck Stone at the time, introduced her to cocaine for the first time. She had already gotten used to being beaten up, and had a previous pimp in another state a year earlier. She started working under the name Candy Stone, a name similar to the pimp. After forcing her to use cocaine, the pimp started teasing her, even though he was using it himself. He started calling her a cokehead. She felt dirty and embarrassed every day, and knew she had to get away from the pimp. Oya Obinidodo never called the police because she never wanted to be labeled a snitch or a rat in the NYC streets or any other streets for that matter. She had some street smarts, and already knew that being labeled a snitch could lead to her death and that being a snitch is the worst label in the world. She didn't have any friends or family that cared, and didn't want to humiliate herself. She took full responsibility for meeting the pimp on Instagram, and knew she needed to make a change. She never worked at any nightclubs in NYC, but was only working as an escort with the pimp. She eventually got away from the pimp, and took a break from going to NYC for a few years. Oya Obinidodo returned in 2018, and entered a drug rehabilitation program in Brooklyn for 2 weeks before running away from the program for multiple reasons, one being that it was too overcrowded and too many women. They were sitting around painting their nails and watching TV shows like Empire and Oprah, and she didn't like the nail polish smell, and doesn't like nail polish. However, she did learn a valuable lesson from a couple of the program counselors. One lesson was that if she needed to take better care of her physical health. One of the speakers at the program was HIV positive, and was teaching about preventing HIV. Obinidodo didn't want to contract anything while being on the streets. After running away from the program, Obinidodo started traveling back and forth to Brooklyn for her outpatient program for 3 years. Around 2019, she started staying at a hostel in a Hispanic neighborhood in Queens. She spent all day hiding in the hostel reading tarot, and only went out for food. She offered online psychic readings for free to occupy her time. The calls started rolling in. She stayed there for several weeks before leaving. She went back to NYC again, meeting men off the street instead of online, and stayed in the Harlem Hotel and in Times Square in different hotel rooms. One day, she met a man on the street that went by the name of Will. She told him that she was writing and he was very impressed. She held on to his compliment, and decided to start writing full-time. Another stranger sent her a message online asking her to write erotica, but she declined. Her conversation with Will was short-lived. By 2021, she visited NYC for the last time. She was tired of being there, and witnessing so much violence. One day she saw blood leaking out a man's head after he got jumped and beat up very badly in broad daylight, and knew it was time to get out of the city altogether. She hasn't returned to NYC since, and has never visited any other city in New York. Washington, D.C. Oya Obinidodo's history in Washington, D.C. dates back to the year 2004. She visited D.C. after asking her father, who died in 2018, for permission. She would visit Southeast D.C. with her father's people. She traveled back and forth to D.C. on a regular basis by 2015, and started working at her after-hours nightclub in PG County. It was basically a brothel.
I worked at a brothel in PG County. It was an after-hours spot where men would go in to find a dancer to have sex with. People called it a trick spot. It began to get humiliating because more and more people started finding out that I was selling myself in there, and I didn't want anyone to know. In DC I had to be cool. I had an image to portray, and I knew a lot of rappers. One of them was supposedly my blood brother, whom I didn't know very well. I really didn't want anyone to find out, but they did. No one was taking care of me. In DC, it's every man for themselves. It is a very gritty city. I only worked there because I needed money bad. After working there off and on weekends for several years, I finally quit because I was too ashamed to continue. There are a lot of bullies in DC. I eventually met another man on Instagram. He was also a bad person. My self-esteem got lower and lower.
By 2020, Obinidodo's experiences in DC started to get worse. She spent most of her nights sleeping on the streets to support her alcohol habit. By 2021, she found a hostel to stay in. It was called Duo Housing. It was her favorite hostel, and she was always treated like a human being there and always had a room to herself for her and her support dog. She stayed at the hostel for a long time before finding out that people from Virginia weren't allowed to live in there due to conflict of interest. It was stated on a sign of the rules in there. At the time, she was drawing unemployment and was safe. She could afford to live in the city for the first time ever in life without resorting to criminal activity. She moved out of the hostel and moved into a hotel on the northwest side. She stayed there for several months. She eventually fled DC for the last time, after developing a new addiction to crack cocaine. She couldn't handle it anymore, and wanted to be a better person. She left DC. She cut off all contact with the dope man and resorted to smoking weed only. She was even offered a legitimate job at a cannabis dispensary, but by that time, she could no longer afford a place to stay. Her unemployment ran out, and she didn't want to depend on the money from the dispensary to pay for her housing. She hasn't been to DC since 2022, and has no plans to return ever again. Baltimore. Oya Obinidodo's experience in Baltimore began around the same time she started working at the brothel in PG County. She worked in Baltimore as an escort off and on for a few years. She never had a pimp in Baltimore, and felt safe. She tried working at a strip club in the red light district, but it was very short-lived. She didn't like the vibe. She saw women smoking crack openly in the dressing room and didn't want to be involved. There were always police outside the club, which made the whole environment look sketchy. She had always been scared of Baltimore City, and heard nothing but horror stories about it. The media always portrayed Baltimore as a murderous, dangerous place. However, whenever she was in the city nothing bad had ever happened to her. She always made her money in peace. She eventually grew older and didn't want to work as an escort in Baltimore anymore. She tried to move there, but no one would rent to her, and quite frankly, it was meant to be. By 2021, she started recording music in other cities in Maryland. By 2022, she released her debut album, Not Your Property. The title speaks for itself. Atlanta. Oya Obinidodo took her first trip to Atlanta in 2003. Her mother took her to a youth conference at a popular mega church owned by a famous pastor. She stayed in Atlanta until the youth conference was over. Sometime during the 2010s she traveled to Atlanta again for the first time in years. She spent a few nights in Atlanta, working as an escort, but only had one client. She left ATL and went back again. This time, it was much, much worse. She wasn't working as an escort. She was living on the streets homeless. She didn't have any money from the government, and suffered extremely bad. She was so poor, no strip club would hire her. Her hair wasn't done and she didn't have any clothes, nor did she have a bodyguard for protection, which was one of the rules. She recalls only having 1 or 2 outfits. She spent many nights on the phone calling homeless hotlines for help. One shelter on the outskirts of the city took her in, but after 2 weeks, kicked her out for being unemployed. She felt bummy. At that time, she didn't have a drug habit, and still couldn't get her life together. She spent nights sleeping on the street, and eventually started sneaking into hotel stairways in Sandy Springs and around Buckhead to stay out of the cold. She was always being harassed by Atlanta police for being on people's private property. She had reached a new level of poverty that she didn't even knew existed. It was sickening. She was extremely busted. People treated her like a bum, and it made her sick to her stomach nearly every day. Sometimes, she would stay at the gym or sleep on the train. Other times, she stayed on the cold streets until she was finally able to draw the attention of someone. A man, who went by the name Lincoln, paid her for a night in his hotel, and then she was able to leave Atlanta forever. In 2022, she published an ebook about her devastating experience in Atlanta called Ain't No Love in the A. She never returned back to Atlanta, and has no desire to face the area ever again. It was the most extreme poverty situation she had ever been in on the East Coast. She had applied for different jobs during her 2 weeks at the shelter, but no one hired her. She then realized that her entire source of financial stability was based on her body. If no one wanted it, then that meant she couldn't survive there. She got tired of living a life of crime and wanted a way out. Going to a city like Atlanta for a fresh start was a huge mistake in the first place.
I regretted going to Atlanta for a long time after I left. I was so fed up with the street life. To this day, I can't believe that I was in so much poverty, distress, and pain.
Since then, Oya Obinidodo has made a decision to never go back to Atlanta. In 2024, she released a song from her second solo album called Telling a Fib. Telling a Fib describes what it's like being a hardcore criminal on the streets of Atlanta. She still has to remind herself through her music of the extreme challenges and the law enforcement she would have to face if she ever went back. She doesn't want to end up in the criminal system in DeKalb County, Fulton County, or any other county for that matter. Sometimes the streets can be unforgiving, and there is no shot at a second chance. Philadelphia. Oya Obinidodo's presence in Philadelphia was extremely short-lived. In the late 2010s, she had only visited Philly a few times, and like Baltimore, she had heard nothing but violence-filled horror stories about the city. The first time she ever went to Philly, she went by car, and it was snowing very hard. She was working as an independent escort. During her short-lived time in Philly, she only had one client. He was a middle-aged, high-class client in Fishtown. She couldn't even afford a hotel, and fled the city that same night because she didn't want to sleep outside in the snow. She didn't waste her time calling hotlines for help. She didn't want to become more embarrassed in her other city any more than she already was. Especially a city like Philly. The second time she went to Philly, she went by bus. She tried working as an escort, but no one called her phone at all. She was looking to meeting more clients like the one in Fishtown, but escorting was a dried up and washed up, unholy hustle in Philly. She resorted to hustling marijuana on the corner of Fulton Street. She knew that was risky business and decided to get out of Philly altogether. She never went back for anything. Atlantic City. Like Philadelphia, Oya Obinidodo's time in Atlantic City was short-lived. She visited Atlantic City for the first time in the late 2010s. The first time she went, she tried working as an independent escort, but never received any clientele. Instead of being stuck on the street, she got a hotel room as soon as she arrived. She didn't make any money, and was in Atlantic City during the wintertime. It was off-season and the AC boardwalk looked like a ghost town. She ended up going to Jersey City with a local rapper she met on Twitter, and the man's cousin. She stayed in a hotel in Jersey City and ate at multiple places, including a Caribbean restaurant and KFC, which she no longer eats at. The Caribbean restaurant in Jersey City was the most authentic Caribbean food she had ever eaten. She eventually stopped talking to the rapper from Twitter, who went by the name TJ, because he was embarrassing her in the streets. He was talking to multiple women, lying to her, spreading rumors about her, and even tried to poison her. He wasn't the charming person she thought he was. He was actually very sinister. He was embarrassing her so badly that she thought she was literally losing her mind. It was around the first time she started hearing voices and hallucinating. Whatever he had laced her with didn't kill her, but messed her up forever. Before cutting him off forever, TJ and Oya Obinidodo, who was going by the alias Dope Candy at the time, rode round Jersey City all day. TJ introduced her to his people throughout the city. Oya Obinidodo went back to Atlantic City in 2021, not to work as an escort, but for a vacation. She drove around the city with her elderly pit bull all day, and decided to sleep in the car instead of getting a hotel room. Oya Obinidodo and her senior pit bull went to a baseball park to hang out. She ended up bathing inside of the porta potty at the park. She was hurting, and knew that her dog was getting very old. She did a little bit of grocery shopping. She let out a loud burst of tears before leaving the city, never to return again. She knew she couldn't stay there. Oya Obinidodo never made any money in New Jersey, and never wanted to explore other parts of the state. She never visited Newark, Camden, or Trenton, and heard nothing but horrible, sinister things about the area. She never sold her body in New Jersey, and had no desire to work there for any reason. Oya Obinidodo's past in North Carolina is pretty terrifying. In 2014, she moved into an affordable housing apartment in Elizabeth City called Walker Landing Apartments. Her apartment was nicely decorated, and everything was always kept neat and clean inside. One day, she drove across the border to Virginia for some action. She went to a brothel in Norfolk. She left the brothel with a man she didn't know, and asked the man did he want to go back to her apartment in North Carolina. The man confessed to getting out of prison, and took her up on her offer. Little did she know, her entire life was about to change for the worse. The man, whose name has been changed to O.G. Hernandez, started pimping her out. He was a seasoned human trafficker, and an expert at selling women. Hernandez locked her up in the bathroom and took her cell phone. He started beating her up every single day. He would physically, sexually, and verbally assault her 24/7. One day inside of the apartment, he started crying after beating her. He said that he was an evil person, and that he couldn't help himself. One day, inside of the apartment, O.G. Hernandez asked her did she have any friends. She said no. Hernandez and Obinidodo began searching for a woman on Craigslist. O.G. Hernandez wanted to build a new stable. One woman from Craigslist ended up at the apartment. Hernandez began to rape Oya Obinidodo and then continued to rape the Henderson woman afterwards. The woman immediately fled the scene, never to be heard from again. Things only got worse from there. O.G. Hernandez began to beat Oya Obinidodo even more, and her eye became black. Her self-esteem got lower, and she was too afraid to tell anyone about the domestic violence. She didn't call the police, and never tried to scream for help. O.G. Hernandez eventually forced her to drive back to Virginia to work as an escort. Obinidodo and Hernandez bounced around from hotel to hotel, while Oya Obinidodo took multiple clients left and right. The money was rolling in extremely fast. In one hotel, Hernandez recruited another girl online and pimped her out too. The girl got away, and Obinidodo was still stuck with him by herself. She and O.G. Hernandez ended up at another hotel, where he beat her up so badly that she knew she had to escape or she would die.
I told him I had to go downstairs. He gave me permission to go, but only under one condition. I had to give up the cell phone and car keys. He took my car keys and phone, while I hid inside another room at the hotel. I stayed in the room and didn't come out.
O.G. Hernandez figured out that she might be trying to call the police. He immediately became suspicious, and decided that he would just leave with her car. He started speeding down the interstate so fast, that he ended up crashing the car, and got arrested by the police. The police found out that the car Hernandez had totaled was registered to Oya Obinidodo, and wanted to question her. She was scared to talk to the police and didn't want to say anything. Instead she went to a program for victims of human trafficking for help. Hernandez went to prison and Oya Obinidodo was left without a car. She was just happy that he didn't permanently disfigure her. Her eye eventually healed. He contacted her one time while incarcerated, but she was too scared to respond. She hasn't heard from him ever since. Hernandez was the first man that had ever started to beat her. O.G. Hernandez ended up in the newspaper for trafficking multiple women. She recognized his face, and started fearing for her life. She kept tabs on O.G. Hernandez's release date, so she could watch her back. He eventually got out, and she has been looking over her shoulder ever since. She doesn't even know where her attacker is. He could still be watching her moves to this very day. He could have moved on and got a job and started a new life. He could be dead, or he could be back in prison. She isn't a stalker, and doesn't want to know. She decided that minding her own business was her best option. She hopes that Hernandez was able to repair whatever problems he was going through and that he is doing well. Even though O.G. Hernandez was a very evil person, she still hopes that he one day becomes a better, successful person. Oya Obinidodo moved out of the apartment and moved into an apartment in Chesapeake, Virginia. She traveled to Charlotte and Raleigh often, to continue working as an escort. She didn't make any money, except in Greenville. One day, while living in her VA apartment, she met another abusive man that went by the name of D. He would come into her house without her permission and spy on her. The man told her that he was from Greenville, North Carolina, and that he wanted to take her out there to meet his family. Oya Obinidodo drove with D to Greenville to meet them. They stayed in a hotel near his parents' house. One night while out partying with D's whole family, she fell into a lake and almost drowned. D and his friends grabbed Oya Obinidodo's body out of the water, before it was too late. Obinidodo told D that it was time to go back to Virginia, and that she didn't want to be in North Carolina anymore. He agreed to go back with her, because he had family in Virginia too. On the way back, Obinidodo stopped at a gas station in North Carolina to get gas. She got into a verbal altercation with Dee in the parking lot. He was verbally abusive, and even pulled her eyeglasses off her face and broke them in half. After that, Obinidodo pulled out a taser and started pressing the button. She didn't tase him. Dee ran away and called the cops. The cops pulled Obinidodo over and handed her a warrant for her arrest. She was charged with assault with a deadly weapon, but the case was later dismissed because Dee didn't show up to testify. After she got back to her apartment in VA, she started receiving random text message threats and unknown phone calls every single day, and even got scared. She eventually believed that Dee had placed cameras inside the house to spy on her, which was the reason he would enter without her permission. She never brought her anti-spy device to check, but instead moved out of the apartment because of the threats. The threats were so bad that she started to lose her mind. She was involuntarily admitted to a mental hospital, developed a drug habit, and couldn't pay her rent anymore. After being released from the hospital, she went to try to purchase a firearm for protection, but was arrested and charged with a felony. Dee was never heard from again, but the trolling and the threats didn't stop there. They continued off and on for the next 7 years. In 2017, Oya Obinidodo was committed to a psychiatric hospital in Raleigh. After being released, she entered a program for victims of human trafficking. She also applied for housing in Raleigh that same year. She didn't like the program at all. It was too many women, and they were nasty to her. After living at the trafficking shelter for several weeks, she eventually got kicked out of the program after getting caught sneaking alcohol into her purse. In 2022, Raleigh Housing contacted her about a Section 8 voucher and gave her an appointment. She decided not to go to the appointment, and was still receiving the threats from the unknown trolls. She was too scared to go back to North Carolina, and hasn't returned ever since. Her father, who was alive at the time, told her that she had relatives that lived in Raleigh, that he took her to visit them only one time in her life when she was a teenager. She wasn't close to them, and they were funny acting towards her. She has gotten their number from her father and called them for support while being hospitalized. Oya Obinidodo's mental health rapidly started to decline after the felony weapons charge and hospitalization. The relatives she thought she had in North Carolina wanted nothing to do with her and ignored her phone calls and voicemails. There was nothing left that Obinidodo wanted to see anymore. She quit working as an escort and doesn't plan on going back to the state for any reason. Obinidodo eventually realized that North Carolina was a very deadly and dangerous place to be. California. Oya Obinidodo flew to Los Angeles, California via Spirit Airlines in 2020 after being trafficked at a human trafficking program on the East Coast. After arriving in LAX, she was informed that her luggage had been misplaced and was accidentally shipped to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The airline attendant told her that it would be about 8 more hours before her luggage was returned. She felt naked. It was her first time ever in life, being on the West Coast, and she didn't know anyone there. It made her sick to her stomach that the airport had lost her suitcase. There was a place that Obinidodo had always heard about, and that place was Skid Row. She figured it would be okay to venture off and go over there, to see if an organization could replace her property. She went to a homeless shelter, and they told her she could move in later that night. She wasn't fazed by the homelessness, but was more so fazed by the massive amount of indecent exposure. People were urinating in the middle of the street, and some were running around completely naked. Anyways, she checked in and stayed there. She wore a blue bandana around her left ankle every day, and started going by the name Oya Obinidodo, after being initiated into Santeria the previous year. She knew how to perform rituals and wore all white every single day of the week. She had a tattoo on her left wrist that said, Crip Killer. She knew it was a mistake. It should have said Blood Killer or Killer Crip. She knew she needed a cover-up, and even resorted to wearing band-aids to cover it up. After being there for a few days, she spoke to a man whose name had been changed to Jar Top Rankin. Jar Top Rankin asked Obinidodo if she wanted to leave the shelter for good, and she agreed to leave with the stranger. Oya Obinidodo and Jar Top Rankin spent every single day together from that day forward. She spent most of her money on Santa Muerte candles, statues, flowers, and Florida water cologne. She opened up an online shop called Botanica Santa Muerte. Obinidodo and Top Rankin traveled around the city every day by bus, sleeping in different hotel rooms, until one day, Jar Top Rankin told Obinidodo that he didn't want to be in LA anymore. He brought her a used car, and forced her to become his private chauffeur. Oya Obinidodo and Jar-Top Rankin went to San Diego, where he became extremely violent. He changed her name to another name and started addressing her as that. Like the previous strangers she entertained, he was physically, verbally, and sexually abusive. He ended up pimping her out at a hotel in Dago called Motel 6. The money started rolling in very fast, and so did the beatings. Obinidodo wasn't surprised. By that time, she had already encountered multiple pimps and was a seasoned escort. While in Dago, Top Rankin told Obinidodo that she could make money the legal way. She applied for the COVID-19 relief. The used car broke down and Oya Obinidodo sold it. Jar-Top Rankin immediately purchased a flashy car with the money Obinidodo made escorting. After leaving Dago, he decided to drive back to LA where he beat her every day. This lasted for several months. One day, she ended up in the hospital. While in the hospital, Oya Obinidodo's life changed. Something happened to her that had never happened to her before. She was very embarrassed by her poverty and still is to this very day. A deposit of $14,000 hit her account. It was the most money she has ever had at one time. She felt even more sick because she knew that the life she had been living on the East Coast was dead wrong and extremely unfair. She didn't tell Jar-Top Rankin about the deposit because she was scared. Instead of running off with the money, she stayed. The first thing she did with the money was pay off her court fines that she had accumulated on the East Coast, leaving her with less than $11,000. Oya Obinidodo stayed in hotels all over LA and Hollywood with Jar-Top Rankin, and he wouldn't stop being abusive. He had introduced her to almost everyone he knew. No one knew what was going on behind closed doors. Obinidodo put on a fake smile around his friends. Eventually, she worked for one day as a stripper in Hollywood where he told her to work. He called her a tard every day and kept blacking her eye. The whole time Obinidodo was in LA, no one bothered to check on her. No one ever does. Her phone never rings. She got tired of putting up with his antics and started to believe that he would kill her. One day, after leaving a hotel, she decided that she was going to walk away. She paid him $700 just to try to get him off her shoulder, but she knew he wanted all of her money. After walking away from Jar-Top Rankin, things got worse. She left Jar-Top Rankin forever with the lump sum and fled to a hotel in Redondo Beach. She entered another program for human trafficking victims, and little did she know, it would be her last time ever going through another program. The trafficking program showered Obinidodo with a duffel bag full of snacks and gift cards to McDonald's, Target, and Walmart. While in the hotel, Obinidodo met a man on the street. She doesn't remember his name, only the huge rolling 60s tattoo he had tatted on his back. He was certainly a one-night stand, and she never heard from the man again. She was trying to get over Jar-Top Rankin. She went back to Hollywood to work as a stripper at the same spot. Unfortunately, she ran into Jar-Top Rankin again. He was walking up and down Hollywood Boulevard. He took her shopping in the fashion district and brought her jewelry, the latest iPhone, and new clothes. They hit it off for one last time, and he was still abusive. She was able to get away safely, and went back to Redondo Beach. One day, she left the hotel to go get something to eat, and decided to visit the animal shelter in Los Angeles. She took the train over there where she adopted the sweetest senior pit bull she had ever seen. Her name was Chelsea. Chelsea became Oya Obinidodo's best friend from that day forward. She was never spotted without her. Chelsea eventually became her emotional support animal. Oya Obinidodo went back to Redondo Beach with Chelsea. After the human trafficking program found out that she had brought a pit bull back into the hotel, she was asked to leave. They had a no-animal policy in the program, even though the hotel was pet-friendly. She felt like she had been unfairly treated. She was extremely upset and trashed the room before leaving. She didn't want to run into Jar-Top Rankin again. He was hot on her tail all over Los Angeles. He started blowing up her phone, asking that she give him back all the gifts he had brought, if she planned on cutting him off. She knew that was too dangerous, so she kept everything, and changed her number, quit working as a stripper, and stayed away from Hollywood Boulevard. She lived in a room on Sunset Boulevard for a week or so, but decided to save the money she had received to move into a better spot. She decided to live on the street with Chelsea in the meanwhile. She became very depressed, and slept outside on the streets for weeks with the lump sum in her pocket. A stranger gave her $5 even though she didn't need it. By that time she only had around $6,000 left. She was still trying to manage an online botanica, and even started a celebrity blog. She went to a tattoo shop, to get the Crip Killer tattoo covered up. The blood gang-related tattoo is no longer visible. She slept on Crenshaw, and even went back to Skid Row. This time, she was asked to get up off the sidewalk. They told her she couldn't sleep right there anymore. She kept moving around to different areas of the city, trying to find a place to sleep. Obinidodo did not have a drug addiction in California. The only thing she used was marijuana. She still didn't want to be in a room by herself. She had to adjust back to being alone. One day, while sleeping outside, a stranger offered her McDonald's. A few minutes later, another stranger, whose name has been changed to Lil Pedro, asked her did she need a place to stay, and she said yes. She and her pit bull Chelsea went into a house with Lil Pedro, where she was later introduced to another man, who knew several other people. The new man, whose name has been changed to OG Rodriguez Miguel, told her that she could stay at a man's house that he knew. The man's name has been changed to Big Julio G. Lil Pedro said okay to the deal and left the scene. He mentioned that he'll be back another day. She went to Big Julio G's apartment with OG Rodriguez Miguel, and was given a blanket and a bed to sleep on in the kitchen. Obinidodo explained to the two men that she only had a few $1,000s left to her name and that she could pay rent. It wasn't a good idea. Big Julio G said that she could stay as long as she needed to. OG Rodriguez Miguel and Obinidodo ended up having a sexual relationship in exchange for Obinidodo's rent. Big Julio G had a girlfriend, and didn't want anything from Obinidodo. She stayed at Big Julio G's apartment with Rodriguez Miguel for several weeks. One day, while going to the grocery store for tamales and burritos, something terrible had happened to Obinidodo. Her card got declined. She swiped multiple times before realizing something wasn't right. She had just used the card earlier that day, and nothing was wrong with it. She was for certain the card had around $6,000 left on it. She called customer service and they stated that the card had been frozen, because they were doing an investigation. She felt sick to her stomach. She only had about $200 cash, and was dependent on the card. She went back to Big Julio G's apartment, where OG Rodriguez Miguel was. The next day, she called customer service again about the issue, but they said over and over that there was nothing they could do about it. She watched the news, only to find out that there was a sting of fraud arrest in Beverly Hills over the COVID money. People were using fake documents to receive hundreds of thousands of dollars from the government. It was unbelievable, and she couldn't believe her eyes. She had lost everything due to the frauds. She didn't even have enough money to stay in California. She tried to go back to the first shelter where she was previously, but they said she had to go through a long waiting period. Then she tried going to another shelter, but she had a fever of 101 degrees and they wouldn't let her in. The fever was heat-related. She hadn't gotten used to weather as hot as South California weather ever in her life. It was about as hot as the California desert and she wasn't prepared. She spent hours on the phone looking for a place to go, but no one would let her in. While at Big Julio G's apartment, Lil Pedro came back over to collect his dues. Oya Obinidodo told him that she didn't have the money. OG Rodriguez Miguel asked Obinidodo did she want to sell sex. By that time, there were about 3 other men in the house. Obinidodo said no, because the men only offered $30. She knew that wasn't enough and didn't want to waste her time. Lil Pedro was upset and said that he wanted to sleep with her. Obinidodo agreed to sleep with Lil Pedro for free in exchange for a longer stay. After Lil Pedro had her body, he fled the scene, leaving her there with OG Rodriguez Miguel and the other men. Eventually the men left, and 2 women came over. Obinidodo caught OG Rodriguez Miguel entertaining one of the women like they were a couple, and couldn't say anything because of what Lil Pedro had just done to her. By that time, she was just ready to get out of California. She was broke, embarrassed, battered, and had nowhere else to go. She eventually got on the phone and asked someone on the East Coast for a bus ticket and the person agreed. The next day, she told Big Julio G and OG Rodriguez Miguel that she would be leaving for the East Coast, back where she was originally from. Big Julio G told her that she could stay longer, and even broke down in tears. Oya Obinidodo was very sad and wanted to stay, but was too scared, and knew that it was time to get out of Cali. The next day, she hugged them and headed to the bus station with Chelsea and her suitcase. She boarded the bus and headed towards the East Coast. The bus stopped in Texas, and that's when her phone rang. It was Big Julio G. He asked her if she needed anything, and if everything was okay. She said yes, knowing it would be the last time she ever spoke to him. She arrived back on the East Coast a couple days later, after spending almost a half year on the hot streets of Los Angeles, California. She hasn't returned to California since, and probably won't ever again. See, here's the thing. California is full of gangs, terrorism, and violence. It's not all sunny days, palm trees, and mimosas. There's a lot more to it than that. Oya Obinidodo is labeled a felon on the East Coast. California's 3 strikes law means that if a person has 3 violent felonies, then the person gets a life sentence. It doesn't matter which state the felonies come from. Living on the streets of Cali is not fun and games. It is very serious. If you hang with the wrong people or end up at the wrong place at the wrong time, then the consequences could cost you your entire life, or your freedom. For Oya Obinidodo, playtime in the state of Cali is officially over. Oya Obinidodo visited South Carolina about 4 times. Her first visit was to Charleston in the late 2010s. She checked into a hotel and started working as an independent escort, but only had one client. She later visited South Carolina with her abusive mother to see her mother's people. By 2019, she visited Myrtle Beach, South Carolina again with her mother on a church bus trip. She ended up having a sexual relationship with the bus driver, who was a predator. She regretted going on the bus trip because she is not a Christian and does not want to be affiliated with any churches in the first place. The relationship between Oya Obinidodo and the bus driver was extremely short-lived. He didn't want to be in a relationship with her. By spring 2022, she visited South Carolina for the last time. She went to Myrtle Beach with her senior pit bull, who was alive at the time, in search of a safe place to go camping. By that time she had developed survival skills and was prepared to be in the wild. Unfortunately, she couldn't find a safe spot that she could afford. She ended up boondocking in Conway, and around various parts of South Carolina. She only lasted a few days. The last property she camped at was private property. She didn't know because the property was listed on an app as a legitimate site. The owner asked Obinidodo and her dog to leave, and she hasn't returned to South Carolina ever since, and has no desire to. Illinois. Oya Obinidodo first went to Chicago in 2021, after leaving Los Angeles, California. She checked in at a hostel and stayed there for 2 weeks with Chelsea. She spent all day at the hostel taking care of the elderly pit bull, and writing a book called Folk Nation. By that time, Chelsea was aging and had developed terminal cancer. Back then, due to COVID-19, the hostel had a policy where a guest couldn't stay for longer than 2 weeks. She was drawing unemployment, and wasn't working as an escort. She had enough money to pay for a place to live. She moved into a hostel on the west side of town, where things took a turn for the worst. The hostel on the west side was cheaper than the one where she was previously, and she had more money to spend. She spent most of the money purchasing products on Amazon, and had to walk miles to the nearest Amazon locker to pick up the packages nearly every day. The packages contained things like clothes, animal supplies, and basic necessities like laundry detergent and hair products. She wore all black every single day, and rarely showed her identity. While living inside the hostel, she met a man outside the building in his car. The man asked her to send him an explicit pic, and she did. After the man received the picture, he didn't want to talk to her anymore. She felt violated by the man, and didn't want to show her face anymore. She started wearing a ski mask nearly every day of the week and always wore long clothing. She spent most of her days reading tarot and burning candles. One day, while walking to the corner store for snacks and alcohol, she met another man. The man, whose name has been changed to OG Nate, was a drug user from the Cabrini Green projects. She started talking to OG Nate nearly every day, and even invited him inside of the hostel where she had been staying. OG Nate and Oya Obinidodo never had a sexual relationship. She eventually developed a bad crack habit. At the time, she wasn't aware of the 2021 crack epidemic that had claimed dozens of other lives that same year. She used and drank in a nearby alleyway nearly every day. One day, it got so bad that she almost passed away.
I almost died. I was vomiting a lot and I couldn't breathe. I knew I was going to OD. I was really scared. I'm surprised that I'm still alive.
Oya Obinidodo's mental health started to decline. She could be seen yelling and screaming to herself while walking around the west side. No one bothered to help. It was sad, and she knew that her addiction had gotten out of control. To make matters worse, her only support, which was her animal, was aging, and dying too. Her animal was scheduled to go to chemotherapy very soon. One day, while inside of the hostel, something terrible had happened to her yet again. The unemployment ran out. She knew for certain that the money would be in there soon, but it never came. She called the unemployment department and they told her that it was over. After living in Chicago for about 2 months, her time was up. She didn't even bother trying to find more help. For her, life always sucked, and she knew that no one would care for her. She left Chicago and headed for the East Coast yet once again. She started to become celibate. During her whole time in Chicago, her legs were always glued shut, and her face was always covered. She didn't want to embarrass herself with another man, like she had did in the other states. She figured that if she ever got her life together, then she could go back to Chicago and live peacefully without being sold as a sex slave. She headed back to Illinois by car in 2022. She stayed in 3 other states along the way. She stayed in Jamestown, Ohio for 1 night, in Brown County, Indiana for 4 nights, and in Benton Harbor, Michigan for 1 night. Eventually, she arrived in Chicago. She drove around looking for a place to stay but couldn't find one. Her monthly income had drastically declined, and her quality of life got even cheaper. She eventually went on the outskirts, about 3 hours away, where she found a campground in southern Illinois. After staying at the campground for 2 days, her only friend died of cancer. She was devastated. She called 911 to tell them that her puppy had died. They told her to call the dog catcher, but after calling the dog catcher, he never came. After screaming and crying for hours, she drug her animal's deceased body into her vehicle herself and rushed her to the vet, where she requested to have her animal's remains cremated. After dropping her animal's body off at the vet, she went back to the campground. The campground's owner felt sorry for her and told her she could live in one of the log cabins for free, if only she agreed to be a housekeeper and clean all of the other cabins. It sounded like a good deal, so she agreed. She was so devastated about the loss of her emotional support that she started drinking heavily. She didn't have a drug habit, and had ditched the drug use after leaving Chicago the first time in 2021. She spent all day at the campground cleaning the cabins and hanging out. One day, she went to another animal shelter. She met a Labrador named Charlie. Charlie was born on a nearby farm, but the owner couldn't keep him. Charlie had a sister named Lucy. The animal shelter told Oya Obinidodo to come visit Charlie for at least a month before leaving with him. She drove to the shelter about twice a week to see the Labrador puppy and played with him. After a month, Charlie was adopted and left the shelter with Oya Obinidodo. Charlie's sister was adopted by a couple, and Charlie was split from his sibling. She took Charlie back to the log cabin, where she and Charlie spent all of their days. She showered him with gifts and enjoyed everything about him. She had never had a Labrador, and was used to taking care of a pit bull. She was writing songs for her debut album, Not Your Property, and also published a non-fiction book called Living Around Dangerous Human Predators and How to Survive Them. She started recording music videos and released a song called Step by Step. She was still managing the celebrity blog and online botanica that she had started in California. She wrote blogs about life problems and animals. She also started writing blogs to expose human traffickers, rapists, and other serial human predators. She was still celibate, and hadn't been meeting any more men. While living at the campground, she started receiving death threats from trolls nearly every day. The death threats got so bad that she cried nearly every day, and even sunk into a lower level of depression. Her mental health declined rapidly and she began to live in fear for her life. She had no idea who was sending the threats. It was the same year that O.G. Hernandez was released from prison. The blog and botanica was eventually shut down for hate speech. Oya Obinidodo was extremely upset that she had lost what she had worked so hard to achieve, but handled it like a gangster.
Everything isn't meant to be. People go out of business all the time. I'm still a writer and a musician. I am still Oya Obinidodo. I am still a human being, and I still deserve respect.
Oya Obinidodo stated. After living at the campground for about 3 months, the campground owner told her that she wasn't a good housekeeper. Obinidodo tried cleaning the log cabins as best as she could, but it still was not good enough. The only cleaning supplies she had were the ones that she brought herself. She eventually left the campground with her new lab puppy. She drove back to the East Coast to continue pursuing a rap career, and has been there ever since. She eventually realized that being a housekeeper wasn't for her. She hasn't returned to Illinois ever since. Virginia. Oya Obinidodo was born in Virginia. She spent most of her life being bullied by predators and being sold as a slave. She has a criminal history and lives day to day. After returning to Virginia in 2022 from Illinois, Oya Obinidodo continued rapping. She started recording more music videos and started performing at open mic nights throughout the Hampton Roads area. In 2023, she started Holy Death Records. That same year, she tried becoming an adult film star, but the men were too gay. She quit making adult films after making only 2. After that, she went back to being celibate. Then she released a low-budget suspense film about her life called The Darkest Death. The Darkest Death was shown at film festivals and was later released on DVD. By 2024, she was tired of Holy Death Records and created a new blog called No Females Allowed. She released her second solo album, The Rough Odows. She spends most of her days taking care of Charlie and writing blogs. She is still celibate and hasn't been meeting any more men. She writes all day long to pass the time.
I really don't care if the people of VA support me or not. There is a lot of evil competitive people out here, and they want everything I have. They don't have to buy my books or listen to my music. I'm still going to be me, even if no one vouches for me. I'm still going to maintain my dignity in the midst of my poverty.
Oya Obinidodo plans on releasing another solo album and another book. She doesn't have any friends and she doesn't hang around women at all. They are very nasty to her and they bully her a lot. She doesn't like the way they look and is irritated by the sound of a woman's voice. She stays to herself, and won't speak to the fake people that neglected her and told on her. While she hasn't received any death threats since 2022, she is still looking over her shoulder. She knows that someone is always watching her, and that she doesn't even have any privacy. She feels unsafe every day, and can never fully get the respect that she feels like she deserves. She has no clue where she will end up next.